you delivered a lecture, Humane, the Politics and Poetics of Endless War. Considering the situation you have just described, that there is very little one can do, and there can only be a political solution, are lawyers who argue for a more humane war for constraints in a way at risk of becoming complicit? Can we become complicit basically given the government waging war legitimacy and an excuse to say, look, we are consulting and we are trying to uphold international standards?
So it's a great question. Thank you. I wouldn't say that we should frame it as a mistake that advocates have made, or allege complicity, because in any imaginable universe, it's going to be a good thing to have people in general and cause groups in particular work on making war less brutal and trying to get all powers, and not to mention non-state actors, to adhere to applicable legal standards that require more humane forms of war. But to come back to your early question and connect it with this one, as in a domestic context, as internationally, ultimately what counts is ordinary people and their mobilization. Again, no one's going to save the world but them. And I have argued that absent kind of popular pressure and other cause groups demanding less force in the world, fewer wars, the noble activity of making war more humane could end up entrenching the violence, or even lead to, to me, a chilling specter of increasingly nonviolent control of some people over others. So, my view is that it's not about blaming advocates. Now, lawyers within government are a different story, because they're frequently yes men and women, and yet that's how international law is supposed to work. That when they sign treaties, states do not just outsource their legal analysis to other actors, but get the authority and right to interpret the law themselves. That doesn't mean we shouldn't reserve the right to criticize their findings, like those of Bush's and Obama's lawyers. But in the end, they're servants of power, and the question is, how can we, as ordinary people, make sure that the risks involved in making war more humane aren't incurred, and that politicians do the right thing rather than the wrong thing.
And you are directing your efforts at your own government and not using it to go after US enemies, which would arguably be a service to the US government.
I don't generally, I do try to put most of the focus of my writing, which is just a minor activity in the scheme of things, on my own government. But that's not to say I refuse to criticize others, which I think is a legitimate activity. I think in some of my writings, that one of which you mentioned, the kind of scholarship on the history of human rights, I've worried that even morally good ideas like human rights can provide, states like mine legitimation for for other acts that are less savory, are less noble. But that doesn't mean the standards themselves don't matter, or that other states are better, let alone pristine. And I'm intensely concerned about Chinese repression of the Uyghurs, and there are many other um, despots, and to criticize and atrocities, to try to figure out how we can help victims. The point is not to um, abstain from judgment about world affairs. On the contrary, it seems like the kind of activity where citizens criticize their own governments only makes sense within a broader progressive internationalism. And my own work is about kind of trying to define the terms of that internationalism beyond the kind of end of history cosmopolitanisms of the 1990s when I was young. And I hope we're in a transition now to not to a more autarkic nationalist world, but one where there's a new progressive internationalism.